The night my mother accused me of stealing my father's inheritance, the ballroom was glowing with chandeliers and false warmth. More than 50 VIP guests stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing softly, champagne glasses raised, the kind of people who never raised their voices because power meant never needing to. I remember thinking how carefully everything had been arranged: the flowers, the music, the speeches about legacy and honor. Then my sister stepped too close to me, and her elbow slipped. Red wine splashed across the object I was holding, dark and violent against something that had taken me years to protect. The room went silent. Before I could even speak, my mother moved. Calm, measured, certain. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't look at my face. She turned to the crowd and said clearly that I had taken what wasn't mine, that I had tried to steal part of my father's inheritance. She said it the way people announce facts, not accusations. Someone beside her produced paperwork. Someone else nodded. No one asked for my side. Security was already at my elbow when I realized the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a script. And I was being written out of the family, live, in front of everyone. They escorted me outside while the party continued behind closed doors. Warm laughter leaked through the glass as cold rain soaked through my dress, turning to icy needles against my skin. I stood there for a moment, stunned, watching my breath fog the night air, while inside they toasted my father's memory and my supposed betrayal. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply walked away, knowing that whatever had just happened was only the beginning. I spent the night in a place that didn't belong to me, a room that smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. My phone lay face down on the table. I didn't have the strength to turn it over. When morning came, the light felt too bright, too ordinary for what had been done to me. The wine-stained fabric from the night before was still folded over a chair. I hadn't touched it. It felt like proof that if I pretended long enough, none of it had really happened. Eventually, I checked my phone. There were messages, but none from my family. A few acquaintances asked if I was okay, their words careful and distant. One text said, "I hope this is all a misunderstanding." No one said they believed me. By noon, my access to a shared account I'd used for years no longer worked. An email bounced back undelivered. It was happening quickly, efficiently, as if they'd been waiting for a signal. For most of my life, I had been the quiet one, the daughter who handled things behind the scenes. I restored what others neglected. I fixed problems no one wanted attached to their name. I stayed invisible because I believed loyalty was a form of safety. If I didn't ask for recognition, I couldn't be resented. If I carried the weight quietly, the family would protect me in return. That night proved how wrong I was. As the hours passed, the shock gave way to something colder. I replayed the moments before the accusation. My sister's forced smile. My mother positioning herself near the front of the room, the document ready in someone else's hand. They hadn't reacted to an accident. They had been waiting for it, or something like it. The object I carried hadn't mattered. I was the point. Late that afternoon, a formal message arrived from a family representative, polite, detached. It suggested that for everyone's sake, I shouldn't make public statements. It mentioned potential legal complications if I did. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. Silence was expected. Guilt was assumed. I sat there, staring at the screen, and felt the last illusion fall away. This wasn't about clearing my name. It wasn't about a single accusation at a party. I had been designated as the problem, the liability, the one who would carry whatever needed to be carried so the rest of them could remain untouched. By nightfall, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. They didn't just want me gone from the room. They wanted me positioned, responsible, quiet. And if I stayed exactly where I was, trying to explain, trying to appeal to reason or love, I would give them exactly what they needed. That was the moment I stopped thinking about defending myself. That was the moment I started thinking about how to survive. I woke up the next morning to the sound of traffic and a headache that felt earned. The room was small and anonymous, the kind of place designed so no one stayed long enough to leave a mark. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I saw the dress draped over the chair, the dark stain on the fabric dried into something ugly and permanent, and the memory snapped back into place. The accusation, the eyes, the way my mother's voice never shook. I showered, letting the water run until it turned cold, as if that might scrub the night off me. When I came back out, my phone buzzed. I didn't rush to it. I already knew what I wouldn't find. No apology, no explanation, no message asking if I was safe. The silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. When I finally checked, the messages that had come in were cautious and thin. I hope you're okay. Heard something strange last night. Let me know if there's anything you want to say. They weren't reaching out to help. They were fishing for confirmation. By mid-morning, the questions stopped. Word had spread, and the version of the story being told didn't include my voice. I tried to log into an account I'd used for years, one that handled routine expenses and records I managed on behalf of the family. The password failed. I reset it. The system told me my access had been revoked. An email followed shortly after, written in careful legal language explaining that due to ongoing concerns, my permissions had been suspended pending review. It read like a courtesy, but it felt like a lock sliding into place. Around noon, a message arrived from someone who had never contacted me directly before. They introduced themselves as representing the family's interests and suggested, kindly, that I refrain from contacting vendors, partners, or outside parties while things were being clarified. The note ended with a warning disguised as advice. Public statements, it said, could complicate matters for everyone involved. That was the first moment I understood how quickly a narrative could harden. I hadn't been given a chance to explain because explanations weren't required. My silence was already being used as confirmation. The story didn't need proof, it needed consensus. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe. For years, I had been the person who handled transitions quietly. When something needed to be moved, closed, or smoothed over, it came to me. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask who benefited. I told myself that trust meant not keeping score. Now, for the first time, I began to inventory those moments, lining them up in my mind like items on a shelf. The pattern was uncomfortable, but it was there. In the afternoon, another message came in, this one more formal. It referenced the inheritance again, along with a phrase that made my stomach tighten. Potential liability. My name appeared in the body of the message, not as a beneficiary, but as a point of concern. I read it twice, then a third time, slower. Whatever they were building, my name was attached to the part that carried risk. The room felt smaller. I stood and paced, replaying conversations I'd never thought to question. The times I'd been told a signature was just procedural. The moments I'd been reassured that everything would be sorted out later. I had believed that being useful made me safe. Now it felt like being useful had made me convenient. Late in the day, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it, but something in me hesitated. The voice on the other end was quiet and professional. They didn't accuse me. They didn't ask me to explain myself. They told me carefully that my name had surfaced in connection with something I should be aware of. They couldn't say much, they said, but they urged me to be cautious, to stay still, to understand that visibility could make things worse. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. That single conversation did what hours of messages hadn't. It confirmed that this wasn't just emotional fallout from a family conflict. There were structures in motion, documents, processes, consequences that didn't care about my feelings or my innocence. As evening settled in, another message arrived from the family side, this one firmer than the rest. It suggested that cooperation would be remembered. The implication was clear. Compliance now might soften things later. I stared at the screen, feeling the pressure close in from both sides, and understood the choice being presented to me. If I stayed visible, if I defended myself emotionally, I would be reacting on their terms. I would be predictable, exposed. If I pulled back, if I let the silence grow, I might buy myself something more valuable than sympathy. Time. By the time night fell, I wasn't thinking about clearing my name. I was thinking about how carefully I needed to move. The accusation at the party had been loud and public. Everything that followed was quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. I lay down without turning on the lights, the city humming outside the window, and accepted the truth I had been avoiding all day. They weren't trying to make me look guilty. They were trying to make me take the fall. I didn't sleep much that night. The warning kept circling back, not as panic, but as a problem that refused to stay abstract. By morning, I sat at the small desk by the window with my phone and laptop, rereading the formal notice line by line. Slower this time. The language was careful, polished, and unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't written to accuse me. It was written to place me. The accusation at this party hadn't been impulsive. It hadn't even been personal. It had been timed. As I read, a quiet certainty settled in. Whatever my family had set in motion didn't begin with a spilled glass of wine. That moment had only made it visible. I began taking inventory, not of money, not of property, but of my role. The years folded together as I listed the things I'd handled without question. Transitions no one wanted to oversee. Temporary fixes that became permanent. Documents I'd been asked to sign because I was reliable. I'd always been told I was the steady one, the daughter who didn't complicate things. Now, in the calm of that rented room, a pattern emerged that made my chest tighten. Whenever something carried risk, my name appeared. Whenever something carried credit, it didn't. I remembered how often my work had been framed as invisible by design, how often I'd been thanked privately and excluded publicly. I told myself that usefulness was its own reward, that loyalty was enough. Seeing it laid out like this, stripped of sentiment, I understood how easily usefulness could slide into expendability. There was a moment that kept pushing its way to the surface, one I'd never given weight to before. I tried to push it aside, but it returned with sharp clarity. It happened years ago, during a family crisis everyone else pretended not to notice. I was called in late, told it was urgent, told there wasn't time to explain. Papers were placed in front of me. My mother stood nearby, her tone soothing, her hand light on my shoulder. She said it was procedural, harmless, that it would be fixed later. I signed because I trusted her, because I trusted the idea of us. The memory left my hands cold. Back in the present, I stared at the wall and felt something shift. That signature hadn't been a favor. It had been a placement. I started requesting copies of records I'd once accessed freely. The responses were polite and slow, then politely non-existent. When something did arrive, it was incomplete. Pages missing, attachments redacted. Enough to confirm what I feared without giving me the full picture. My name was attached to obligations, not assets. Exposure, not ownership. I wasn't the beneficiary of anything. I was the buffer. Fear crept in then, but it didn't overwhelm me. It clarified me. Fairness stopped mattering. Survival took its place. Another call came that afternoon, this one shorter than the first. The voice on the other end didn't need to explain much. They confirmed what I was already piecing together. Someone had needed a visible name, one that could absorb attention and consequences. Someone who could be positioned as greedy, unstable, or desperate if things went wrong. My name fit because I had always stayed quiet, because no one expected me to fight back. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder and far more dangerous. Understanding. This wasn't favoritism gone wrong. This wasn't a family conflict spiraling out of control. It was design. I had been placed where the impact would land hardest and the resistance would be weakest. They had counted on my loyalty to keep me compliant and my silence to keep me isolated. For the first time, I stopped thinking of myself as naive. I saw the intelligence in the way they'd used me, and in that same moment, I saw the flaw. They had mistaken patience for passivity. They had assumed I wouldn't see the shape of the trap until it was closed. I closed my laptop and sat very still. The question was no longer whether I could prove my innocence. The question was how long I could remain predictable without putting myself in real danger. The answer was clear: not long. As evening approached, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and steady. I wouldn't confront them. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't demand answers from people who had already written my role for me. If I stayed visible, if I reacted the way they expected, I would complete their design. If I stepped out of it, quietly and completely, I might change the outcome. That night, as the light faded from the window and the city settled into its own rhythms, I understood why they needed me silent, and why disappearing might be the first move they never planned for. I stopped answering messages that night, not out of fear, but because every reply tied me back to a version of myself they already controlled. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to correct the story. Staying visible kept me within reach, and I finally understood that reach was the danger. The decision to disappear wasn't dramatic, it was practical. I turned off notifications, changed routines, and let the unanswered calls stack up. I avoided places where my name might travel faster than I could. I let people assume I was overwhelmed, unstable, ashamed. Misjudgment became a shield. If they believed I was unraveling, they would stop looking closely. I left the room I'd been hiding in before dawn, carrying only what I needed. No keepsakes, no documents that could be taken from me. The place I chose wasn't meaningful, and that was the point. No family history, no shared memories, just anonymity and quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder before it steadies you. The first night there, I didn't sleep. The silence felt unnatural, like a pause in a song where you expect the chorus to hit. For years, my days had been shaped by other people's expectations. Problems arrived, and I solved them. Requests came, and I handled them. Now there was nothing pressing against me. No urgency, no voice asking for help. It was unsettling, and then slowly it was clarifying. In that space, I did the one thing I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I organized, not emotionally, but methodically. I built timelines, I wrote down names, I noted when responsibilities shifted to me and when credit shifted away. I treated my own life like a case file, stripped of excuses and good intentions. Patterns surfaced quickly once I stopped defending them. Every instance of praise came paired with risk. Every reassurance preceded a transfer of responsibility. My mother's voice echoed in my head, warm and confident, telling me this was temporary, that everything would be fixed later. I saw now how often later had never come. As the days passed, the manipulation sharpened into focus. Conversations I'd once thought of as supportive revealed their conditions. Compliments had been permissions. Trust had been leverage. The pain was still there, but it no longer ran the room. Understanding had taken over, and understanding gave me distance. Late one evening, while reviewing a set of records I'd kept copies of without thinking much of it at the time, I noticed something small and wrong. A date that didn't align. A step that had been skipped because everyone assumed someone else had handled it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it mattered. It mattered because it existed, because it hadn't been corrected, and because their accusation at the party had brought it back into relevance. I sat with that discovery longer than I needed to, not because I didn't know what it meant, but because I knew what it didn't. It wasn't a weapon. Not yet. It was a vulnerability, a hairline crack in something they believed was solid. The realization steadied me. They had built their plan on the assumption that I would panic or confess, that I would rush to defend myself and in doing so expose more of myself to them. They hadn't accounted for patience. They hadn't considered that silence could be chosen. I didn't contact anyone. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't warn them that I'd noticed anything at all. I let the days stretch and watched as their version of events grew louder without me. Statements became longer. Explanations repeated themselves with slight variations. Every word added to the record they were creating. By the end of the week, the quiet had changed shape. It was no longer emptiness. It was space. Space to think, to observe, to wait. Time stopped feeling like something that was running out and started feeling like something that belonged to me. I understood then that disappearing wasn't about escape. It was about letting them move freely, unguarded, confident in a narrative they thought I had accepted. The more they spoke, the more they revealed. The less I did, the clearer everything became. I turned off the light and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of a city that didn't know my name. For the first time since the party, I felt steady. I was no longer running. I was waiting. Silence changed everything faster than I expected. The first few days, I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, waiting for something to demand my attention. Then the urge faded. I stopped checking for messages that weren't coming, stopped bracing for accusations that no longer arrived directly. Without me in the room, without my reactions to anchor their story, my family grew louder. They explained, they justified, they repeated themselves. And in doing so, they lost control of the rhythm they were used to conducting. From where I was hiding, the distance sharpened my thinking. I wasn't distracted by hurt or fear anymore. I could see how much of my life had been spent maintaining continuity for others. My work had never been about ownership or recognition. It had been about preservation. I knew how things aged, how records drifted, how procedures broke down when no one paid attention. While everyone else focused on money and appearances, I had focused on structure, on what lasted when people stopped looking. That was the part they underestimated. I began reviewing older materials I'd once handled automatically, the way you might flip through a familiar book and suddenly notice a line you'd skipped every time before. Somewhere between the third and fourth pass, something caught. A detail that didn't match. Not a dramatic error, not a missing signature or an obvious falsification. It was subtler than that. A procedural step that had been bypassed years ago because it was inconvenient. A requirement no one bothered to revisit because it hadn't mattered then. It mattered now. The accusation Balboa at the party had forced certain statements into the open. By framing me publicly as someone who had interfered with inheritance matters, my family had triggered obligations they clearly hadn't anticipated. Declarations had been made. Positions had been taken. The thing they believed would destroy me had activated a chain of consequences they hadn't accounted for. Every time they repeated the lie, they reinforced it. I didn't celebrate the discovery. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm in a way that was almost unfamiliar. This wasn't about catching them out or exposing them myself. It was about understanding that systems don't care who you are or why you lie. They only care that you do. I shared the finding with someone who had no loyalty to my family and no interest in drama. I didn't tell them the whole story. I didn't need to. I showed them the inconsistency and waited. Their reaction was restrained but unmistakable. They didn't ask if I wanted to act, they asked when. And when I hesitated, they nodded, as if they already knew the answer. Too soon would protect them. Too late would dilute the impact. Timing wasn't a detail. It was the point. As the days passed, I watched from a distance as my family leaned harder into their version of events. Public reassurances grew longer. Private pressure increased. Someone reached out through a mutual contact, suggesting I could make things easier if I cooperated. I ignored it. Cooperation now would undo everything silence had created. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment they chose to humiliate me publicly was the moment they lost the ability to manage the fallout quietly. What had been intended as a warning shot had become a record. A trail, a reference point that couldn't be erased without drawing attention to itself. I stopped thinking in terms of defense altogether. There was nothing left to defend. My name would clear itself or it wouldn't. What mattered was that I stopped insulating them from the consequences of their own actions. For years, I had absorbed problems before they reached the surface. I had smoothed over gaps, corrected oversights, quietly prevented exactly the kind of exposure they were now courting. This time, I did nothing. That was the hardest part. Not acting felt wrong after a lifetime of fixing things. Every instinct urged me to step in, to warn someone, to slow the damage. I resisted it. I reminded myself that restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. The longer I stayed silent, the more they talked. The more they talked, the more they documented. Each explanation contradicted the last just enough to matter. Each attempt to control the narrative added another layer to the problem they believed they were containing. I realized then that I didn't need to reveal the secret at all. I didn't need to confront anyone or make demands. All I had to do was step aside and let the systems they had taken for granted do what they were designed to do. Power, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. As long as I remained quiet, they kept moving, confident I was broken, ashamed, or too frightened to surface. They never considered that silence could be deliberate. They never imagined that the person they had always counted on to clean up after them had simply stopped. And with every passing day, the distance between what they believed and what was actually happening grew wider. I stayed where I was, watching the gap widen, understanding that the secret I held wasn't something I would use. It was something I would stop protecting them from. The first day passed without incident. No headlines, no urgent calls. The world kept moving at its usual pace, and from the outside nothing appeared to have changed. My family continued with their routines, their confidence intact, their public faces composed. I understood then how much patience this would require. Systems didn't collapse on command. They moved slowly, deliberately, and only when enough weight had been placed on the right pressure points. I marked the days quietly, not on a calendar, but in my head. Day 1 was about restraint, about resisting the urge to check, to interfere, to confirm that anything was happening at all. Silence pressed in, but I held it. If this was going to work, it had to look like nothing. By day 2, the first hairline crack appeared. I heard through a neutral channel that a routine transaction connected to my family had been delayed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to cause inconvenience. A question had been raised where no question had existed before. The response from my family was immediate and overly reassuring, the kind of reassurance that only draws more attention. They were still confident, but the edges had softened. On day 3, I sensed the shift. It wasn't official yet, but it was personal. A mutual contact asked if I was doing okay. The words chosen carefully, the timing too precise to be casual. Another person asked if anyone had heard from me. The curiosity wasn't concern. It was calculation. They were trying to locate me without asking directly. I stayed unreachable. Not evasive, just absent. There is a difference, and people can feel it even if they don't understand it. Fear flickered then, brief and sharp, but it didn't take hold. I reminded myself that unpredictability was now my protection. Day 4 brought the first visible inconsistency. A statement attributed to my family contradicted something they had said earlier in the week. The change was subtle, a shift in phrasing meant to sound more compassionate, less absolute. To anyone not paying attention, it would have seemed like nothing. To a system built on records and consistency, it was a marker. Once something is said publicly, it exists. Once it changes, it leaves a trail. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only precision. This wasn't about watching them suffer, it was about watching them reveal themselves. By day 5, the pressure was coming from inside their circle. Someone postponed a meeting. An invitation quietly disappeared. A partner asked for clarification before moving forward. Doubt spreads faster than truth because it doesn't need proof. It only needs discomfort. I could see how quickly confidence began to fracture once it wasn't reinforced. The calls and messages intensified, indirect but persistent. Suggestions, offers, warnings framed as concern. They still believed I could be managed if I could be reached. They hadn't adjusted to the idea that I was choosing not to respond. Day 6 was the hardest. A formal notice was logged. Nothing public yet, but official enough to matter. An inquiry had been opened, a flag raised. It was no longer theoretical. The process had entered a stage that couldn't be undone quietly. I prepared myself then, not for confrontation, but for visibility. I knew it was coming back. The question was how and on whose terms. I still did nothing. I didn't call anyone. I didn't move. I didn't break the silence. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment to act, to step in and steer the outcome. I ignored it. Acting now would collapse the distance I'd built. Waiting would let the structure finish assembling itself. On the 7th day, it happened. Not at my door, but at theirs. A knock they couldn't ignore. A notice delivered in a setting that mattered, witnessed by people who understood exactly what it meant. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority rarely raises its voice. I learned about it shortly after, through a channel that had no reason to embellish. The words were factual, procedural, final in a way that made denial impossible. I felt no rush of relief, no surge of triumph, just steadiness. I understood then why waiting had been the most difficult part. Waiting required trust in a process I couldn't see, faith in an outcome I couldn't control. It required me to let go of the need to prove anything and accept that the truth didn't require my participation to surface. The countdown was over. The silence had done its work. And for the first time since the night of the party, I knew the next move wouldn't belong to me at all. The reckoning didn't happen in a courtroom or under flashing lights. It happened in a place my family had always treated as untouchable. A professional setting where reputation mattered more than volume and authority arrived with paperwork, not threats. The same circle that had watched me be escorted out days earlier now watched as officials stepped in, calm and precise, and asked for records that couldn't be produced on the spot. I wasn't there when it happened. That was intentional. I learned about it through a neutral message that carried no emotion, only facts. An inquiry had been formally initiated. Certain operations were paused pending review. Access had been limited. It was the kind of language that made arguing pointless. This wasn't a discussion. It was procedure. What struck me most was how quiet it all was. No raised voices, no accusations thrown back and forth. Just the steady rustle of papers and the polite insistence that certain questions be answered. Authority, I realized, doesn't need to perform. It only needs to arrive. From a distance, I imagined my mother's expression. She had always commanded rooms with a look, a pause, a carefully chosen word. I could see her trying to maintain that composure, adjusting her tone, asserting control through familiarity. But this wasn't a space where familiarity helped. This was a space where records mattered more than relationships. My sister didn't fare as well. Her reactions were quicker, sharper, easier to read. Where my mother recalculated, my sister panicked. She spoke too much, asked the wrong questions, reached for explanations that only raised more. People who had once laughed easily around her began to step back, suddenly busy, suddenly unavailable. The story my family had told about me started to unravel under the weight of its own repetition. Statements made at the party were now part of the record. Claims intended to humiliate me had become fixed points that demanded consistency. When those claims were examined, they didn't align with the procedures that had been followed, or more accurately, the procedures that hadn't. The flaw I had found quietly weeks earlier was no longer theoretical. It was official. What had once been an overlooked step was now a question that required an answer, and there was no version of that answer that didn't expose the design behind my framing. The lie they had used to remove me had bound them to a process they couldn't control. I returned briefly, on my terms. Not to argue, not to plead, not to explain myself. I appeared because accuracy matters, and absence can only do so much once the process is in motion. I said very little. One factual statement. One clarification that needed to be on record. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I let the document speak where emotion never could. The effect was immediate and devastating in its restraint. My presence confirmed what many had begun to suspect. I wasn't hiding because I was guilty. I had stepped back because chaos is louder than truth, and I had refused to compete with it. The ripple effects followed quickly. Accounts were frozen pending review. Projects were halted. Invitations were rescinded without explanation. People who had once been eager to associate suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. Power depends on confidence, and confidence fractures when certainty disappears. Inside the family, unity collapsed. The solidarity they had performed so easily in public turned inward, sharp and accusatory. Blame shifted, alliances cracked. The same loyalty that had been demanded of me was nowhere to be found when it mattered to them. I watched it all with a strange sense of calm, not because I enjoyed it, but because it confirmed something I had needed to know. Losing power hurt them more than any punishment could have. They didn't fear consequences. They feared irrelevance. When it was over, or as close to over as these things ever get, I felt the weight of finality settle in. There would be hearings, reviews, processes that moved at their own pace, but the outcome, in its most important sense, was already decided. The story had shifted, and it wouldn't shift back. I didn't feel vindicated. Vindication requires an audience willing to admit it was wrong. What I felt was distance. Distance from the night that had defined me in their eyes. Distance from the role I had been assigned without consent. The law hadn't knocked because I asked it to. I hadn't made a call or issued a threat. I had simply stopped absorbing the impact meant for others. I had stepped aside and let the structure they relied on do what it was designed to do when exposed to light. As I left that chapter behind, I understood the cost of control. It demands silence from others and certainty from yourself. The moment either slips, the illusion collapses. They had chosen their moment carefully, believing I would crumble under the weight of public shame. They had never considered what would happen if I didn't. When the noise finally stopped, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Not empty, just different. The messages slowed, then faded. The urgent tones disappeared, replaced by a kind of cautious distance, as if the world had decided the story was finished and moved on to something else. I realized then how quickly public attention evaporates once a spectacle loses its shine. I didn't feel victorious. There was no surge of relief, no sense of triumph waiting on the other side of it all. What I felt was lighter than that, cleaner. The weight I'd been carrying for years, the responsibility that never quite belonged to me, had loosened its grip. Justice, I learned, doesn't announce itself with celebration. It arrives quietly and leaves behind a sense of finality you can't argue with. The consequences unfolded in measured ways. My mother's authority didn't collapse overnight, but it drained away steadily. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations ended sooner than they used to. People who once sought her approval now spoke to her with polite caution, as if she had become unpredictable. Reputation, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes. My sister reacted differently. Fear drove her where loyalty never had. She scrambled, made choices that exposed her priorities, distanced herself from anyone who might slow her down. Watching it, I understood something I hadn't before. The protection she'd always received hadn't strengthened her. It had hollowed her out. What struck me most was that none of it required me to intervene. The family didn't unravel because I confronted them. It unraveled because the truth was finally allowed to stand on its own. Exposure did more damage than punishment ever could. I chose not to rewrite the past. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I didn't ask for acknowledgement. Closure doesn't come from forcing people to admit what they did. It comes from accepting that some people will never see you clearly and deciding that you no longer need them to. Forgiveness wasn't the point, distance was. I drew a line and stayed on my side of it. With that space came something unexpected. A chance to reclaim who I was without the family narrative shaping every decision. I returned to my work, not as a quiet fixer in the background, but on my own terms. I redirected my skills toward projects that aligned with my values, where preservation meant care, not concealment, where my name belonged to my choices. There was one small, symbolic thing I did for myself. I let go of an object that tied me too tightly to the old version of my life. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement that I didn't need to carry proof of who I'd been in order to know who I was becoming. Standing there, in a moment that belonged only to me, I understood what this story had really been about. The deepest betrayal wasn't the accusation or the public shame. It was the years of being used, trusted just enough to be exploited, and discarded the moment I became inconvenient. Revenge was never my goal. Self-respect was. I didn't win. I walked away. And there is a difference that matters. If you've listened this far, maybe some part of this story feels familiar. Maybe you've been the quiet one, the reliable one, the person who carried more than their share because it felt like love, or duty, or loyalty. If so, I want to ask you something. Where would you draw the line? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or your own story in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people are listening and how powerful it can be to know you're not alone. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories about boundaries, quiet strength, and justice that doesn't require cruelty, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. These stories matter because they remind us that dignity is something we are allowed to choose. Thank you for being here. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.